himself when he arranged for me to find out what it was like to work for a living. As hard as working in the mines at night and taking a full load of classes during the day would be, unlike my generation, that was pretty common for his generation. So imagine the conflicts between the generations. Parents who had made their way out of the Great Depression with hard work, followed by a generation of young people who were determined not to have to work as hard as their parents. This is proof that God has a sense of humor. Think about this for a moment. The story of Moses. He came from poor people, and he knew eventually that he came from a race of slaves, but his story was different. You remember his story. As a baby, his mother placed him in a basket and put him in the river at a specific time in a specific place where he could be found by Pharaoh's daughter. So this poor Hebrew boy ends up growing up in the palace, and he got a royal education. But as his story unfolds, it became clear that he knew where he came from. One day, after he had become a young man, he sees this taskmaster abusing a Hebrew slave, and being a young man full of himself and idealism, he reacts without any real insight into the dynamics of his day. In his mind, he was trying to save his people. And he attacks what he sees as an injustice against his people, obviously thinking that he can get away with it and be a part of the solution. Instead, he becomes part of the problem. And he is then not only rejected by the Egyptians, but he's rejected by his own people as well. The worst of all punishments. He is banished from everything and everyone that he knows. So here's this young man with all the promise in the world who ends up as a nomadic shepherd. He must have experienced a profound sense of loss, yet having no idea how God might use his circumstances. Think about this. All those years wandering the desert ended up serving him well one day. The time would come when he would lead the Jewish people through that desert for 40 years. It must have been fascinating to look back on his life. But more importantly, think about the context of this Old Testament passage that we read. Moses clearly never lost his capacity for wonder. He always remained open to what God might have in store for him today. One day, he noticed something very odd and out of place. A bush was on fire, but it was not being consumed. And the way it reads is so interesting. It says, when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. Think about it. It does not say that God called out to get his attention. It says that when he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. When Moses was open to it and turned aside to see, God called to him. He made his way to this place, and now this older and wiser Moses encounters God himself after all those years and is charged with what? Trying to save his people again. Can you imagine what that must have been like for him? This morning, I want to give you a little context before we talk about the New Testament passage. Do you think Jesus knew the story of Moses? I'm convinced those stories had a tremendous impact on Jesus. And I'm convinced that this is one of the many reasons that Jesus never lost his capacity for wonder about what God might have in store for him next. Before we talk about this New Testament passage where Jesus has this encounter with this Samaritan woman, I want to tell you a story about a friend that I had at my church in Kentucky. He was a retired truck driver from Jim Beam. He wasn't much older than me, but a lot of those guys would go to work right out of high school, and then 30 years later, they can retire. So he was 50 and retired with a pension. Anyway, he was on the pastor search committee that brought me to the church, and we just always had a connection. Well, one day, he had me over to his house and showed me what his hobby was. We went into his garage where he spent his weekends restoring this 1943 convertible, and it was spotless. It was absolutely beautiful. It was his pride and joy. So we're talking about it and how he went about getting all these original parts. That's an important part if you know anything about that. He and his buddies would spend every weekend helping each other with each other's cars, but really jumping through all of these links to get these original parts. And I got around to asking him, well, man, how much money have you put into this car? He had no idea. He had no idea how much money. He had no idea how much time he had put into restoring this car to its potential. He just knew that he found great joy in two things: restoring that car and helping us turn that church around from a pretty sad place to be to a joyful place. His past had served him well. Even though he was retired, he never lost his capacity for wonder and for what God might have in store for him and that church next. Do you remember years ago this book called Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten? It was written by a guy named Robert Fulghum. He's written many books, and almost all these books are just short essays. One of these essays, I'll never forget it, was how this guy found great meaning teaching driver's ed in high school. How does that work? This guy found great fulfillment in helping these students move over that threshold in life from not knowing how to drive to being a good driver. And there was one thing for sure about his job: every day was a new experience. He never knew what might be in store for him next. Okay, so Jesus is traveling one day and he encounters this Samaritan woman at a well. It's noon. The people who heard that story for the first time would have read into that a little. People didn't generally go to the well in the heat of the day. They would go in the morning when it was cool. And it was a social event of sorts. That's where they would meet and talk, right? But this woman is there by herself in the middle of the day, probably because she's avoiding the other women. She's probably the topic of all of their gossip. But on this day, she encounters a Jewish stranger who in one conversation would change her whole worldview about how God would think of her and what God may really be like and about what God might have in store for her. But it seems clear to me from the rest of this passage that encounter had a powerful impact on Jesus too. Remember that all the disciples had gone to get Jesus something to eat. He must have been hungry when they left, but when they return, they are struck by two things. One was that he's engaging with this Samaritan woman. Remember, Jews believe Samaritans practice what they believe to be a heretical form of Judaism. But remember the rest of the story. Jesus not only is no longer fatigued, he tells them he's no longer hungry. He says, my food is to do the will of the one who sent me. In effect, he's telling them and telling us that doing God's work has revitalized him, that it has given him the energy that he needs, and that this encounter had had an impact on him too. For most people, work takes it out of us. That's why we value vacation so much in our society. But that is the opposite of what we see here with Jesus. His openness to what God may bring his way, his openness to each new encounter, literally, not figuratively, but literally re-energized him. Let me ask you a question this morning. Can we do that? How does this happen? Number one, Jesus was not forced to do anything. He wanted to do it. He was drawn to it because each person was so interesting to him. He felt like it needed to be done. And number two, it was not a burden to him. I think about my buddy working on that old car. The revitalization that resulted on both ends of this encounter is because one of the most basic needs we have in life is to have some sense of purpose. Several years ago, our church hired a consultant to walk us through a visioning process. And he told us that he always asked this question at the beginning of that process: what is most important about this church? He said the answer is always the same: the people. And that's exactly what our people said. And it gave him the opportunity to correct us. He said, no, the good people of the West Hills Baptist Church are not the most important thing. What is most important is your purpose. Why are we here? To do the work of Christ right here, right now. If you see the purpose of our church and see your own work as being the work of Christ with whatever God has given you, with whomever God has placed in your path, if you see that as your purpose, it changes your perspective. Work does not have to be seen as a burden. It can be a means to an end in a lot of different ways, but it can always become the occasion to help people. I want you to allow the history teacher to come out a little bit this morning. You know that I'm a storyteller at heart. So when I was teaching history, I always tried to include something personal. How might you do that when you talk about World War II and what happened? When I taught about those horrible concentration camps in World War II, I would not only talk about the number of people that died, I also talked about the people that lived and what might have been the difference between the two. Now, obviously, millions were gassed and killed, but there were also many who were not gassed but still died. And then there were the ones who survived and made it back to tell their stories. What was it, do you think, those people who made it back had in common? They talked about how they had something to live for. They talked about how they had somebody to live for. Our purpose is something we hunger for because it gives us meaning in what we do. And may I suggest that being open to the wonder of what God might have in store for your life can bring about the kind of fulfillment that God has had in store for you all along. When I look back on my days as a student, on my days as a teacher, And on the last 18 years as a pastor, too many times what I have seen are teachers who don't really like kids, pastors who really don't love their congregations, people who pursue a career for the wrong reasons. Their hearts are not in what they are doing. And what is the result? A life of resentment, boredom for everybody involved, and their work causes them to be drained. Now compare that to the life of Jesus. Not only is it the opposite, but what we find is a secret. We find meaning in our purpose, and our purpose is fueled by being open to the wonder of what God might have in store for us next. One of the many reasons I love about being the pastor of this church is how clear it is that what we do here is not just about us. When we see our purpose as being a part of something bigger than ourselves, we can recognize that what we are doing here has eternal implications. Think about how Jesus thought about those stories of Moses. Hundreds of years had passed, but Jesus saw himself as being connected to Moses. And now, hundreds of years have passed since Jesus walked the earth, and here we are today with all these little ones who will remain here when our time here ends. We are all connected. And it is my greatest hope that each of us leave this place better than we found it, due to the wonder and the purpose and the fulfillment that we find living the ways of Christ. Before we leave this morning, I want to share with you just a little bit of my story. When Kim and I met, I was teaching high school and found great fulfillment in it. But after we got married, I felt the need to try some new things, and eventually found myself making really good money and finding no fulfillment in it whatsoever. What I did not know at that time was that I was being prepared for something else. God was removing obstacles in my life, not just to be open to ministry, but to be open to the capacity for wonder at what God might have in store for me today. Moses went back to Egypt with a kind of wisdom that he did not have as a young man. Jesus left his encounter that day, and the disciples were astonished that he could be fed and be revitalized by doing God's work in that moment. What about you? Look around you and see how the fields are ripe for harvest. Look around you. See how the fields are ripe for harvest. I wonder, what might God have in store for you next? In a moment, we're going to sing. We're going to recognize that what we do here is not of our own doing. We don't come here to make something happen. We come here to be a part of something. We invite the Holy Spirit to work within us and between us. And because that can always be a powerful thing, we always give the invitation. And if you want to make a public profession of your faith and the risen Christ as your Savior, there's no better day than today. Or if you're looking for a church family who wants nothing more than to meet you where you are in life, to join us where we are on our journey, and just to grow in God a little bit each day, then we would welcome you with open arms into the family of faith here at the West Hills Baptist Church. The hymn is number 692, God Will Take Care of You. What a perfect hymn to sing at this time. Will you stand? Will you sing? Will you respond? such a good day. So glad to have each of you here, and I so appreciate those who are connecting with us online. Please know that our ministers are very easy to find, very easy to access. You can connect with us through our website or our Facebook page, or just call the church. We would love nothing more than to be able to connect with you in that way. But I'm just so glad to have everybody here today. It's been a good day. If you felt God's presence this morning, I hope you'll tell somebody about it. I hope you'll bring them back with you next Sunday. Why in the world would we keep this to ourselves? So will you remain with us now as we have our open-eyed benediction. May the road rise to meet you. May the wind blow at your back. May the sun shine warmly on your face. May the rain fall softly on your field. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand.
To all Uh-oh.